You have been walking for weeks. Your sandals are worn through. Your water is nearly gone. The last village you passed was days behind you, and the road has narrowed to a dusty track through farmland and open plain. But ahead, it opens onto something you have only heard about in stories told by monks who passed through your village years ago. High brick walls stretching further than you can see in either direction, towers catching the late afternoon light, and beyond them, the low, constant hum of hundreds of voices arguing, reciting, questioning, all at once. You have reached Nalanda. Somewhere behind those walls are people who have devoted their entire lives to logic, medicine, grammar, and the nature of the mind itself. Scholars whose names are spoken with reverence in kingdoms you've never even heard of. And you are about to try to become one of them, if they let you in. So what was it actually like to live and study here? Not the legend, not the tourist plaque. The real day-to-day experience of an ordinary student at one of the ancient world's great centers of learning. By the 5th century CE, Nalanda, in what is now the Indian state of Bihar, had grown into a sprawling monastic and educational complex, expanded over generations under the patronage of the Gupta dynasty and later, other regional rulers who saw value in supporting it. Archaeological excavations at the site have uncovered rows of multi-story monasteries, temples, courtyards, and structures that may have served as assembly or teaching halls, spread across an area far larger than any single school a traveler of this era would ordinarily encounter. A student arriving for the first time would have walked through open farmland and patches of forest before the walls even came into view, and then straight into a world of near-constant motion. Monks moving briskly between buildings on errands and duties. Bells marking the hours of the day. The overlapping sound of scripture being recited aloud, again and again, the way a text was drilled into memory long before it was ever written down for the student themselves. We can reasonably imagine the sheer scale was overwhelming for someone seeing it for the first time. This wasn't a lone teacher and a handful of pupils gathered under a tree, a common and perfectly respectable form of education elsewhere in the ancient world. This was something closer to a small, self-contained city, built almost entirely around the act of study. Why would anyone travel this far, weeks or even months on foot, for something like this? Because reputation traveled faster than roads did. Word of Nalanda scholars, its libraries, and its demanding intellectual culture had spread across India and beyond, carried home by earlier travelers and pilgrims. For an ambitious young mind in the 5th, 6th, or 7th century, there may have been no more prestigious place in the known world to test yourself. And that brings us to the question this whole story is built around. What was everyday life actually like for a student at Nalanda? Getting in was the first test, and by most accounts it was brutal. The Chinese monk Xuanzang, who studied at Nalanda for several years in the 7th century and left the most detailed surviving account of the institution, described gatekeepers, sometimes referred to as Dvarapanditas or gate scholars, stationed at the entrance to question applicants on logic, grammar, and philosophy before they were permitted inside. Those who couldn't hold their own under this kind of questioning were simply turned away, sent back the way they came. Later accounts and popular retellings often attach a specific rejection rate to this process, sometimes cited as high as 70 or 80% of applicants failing to gain entry. These figures should be treated with real caution. They tend to come from second-hand tradition and later summary rather than precise contemporary record-keeping. And Xuanzang's own writing is far more descriptive than statistical. What we can say with real confidence is this. Admission was not automatic. It was not based on wealth, family name, or connections, and it was tied directly to demonstrated intellectual ability, tested out loud, in person, by people qualified to judge it. That single fact tells us something important about the whole institution before a student has even set foot inside. Nalanda wasn't a place you simply attended. It was a place you had to earn, publicly, through your own mind, standing at the gate with everything to prove. Once admitted, a student's life became fully residential, a detail historians often point to as one of Nalanda's most distinctive features for its time, and part of why it's sometimes described as one of the earliest large-scale residential centers of learning anywhere in the world. Excavations at the site have revealed multi-story monastic residences, known as viharas, arranged around central courtyards, with rows of small individual cells lining the upper floors and accessible by internal staircases. A student most likely slept in one of these modest cells, bare functional, built for rest rather than comfort, close to dozens of others living the exact same rhythm of study and religious observance. This wasn't a campus in the modern sense, with private dormitories, personal furniture, or the kind of individual space we might picture today. It was communal by design, almost by necessity. Meals, prayer, study, and the passage of each day all happened in close proximity to other students and monks, because Nalanda was, at its core, a Buddhist monastic institution first, and an educational one built directly on top of that religious foundation. The two were never really separate. Here's where Nalanda breaks from the common assumption that it was purely a religious seminary, memorizing scripture and little else. Buddhist philosophy and doctrine were certainly central to life there, but historical sources describe a curriculum that extended well beyond religious texts. Students studied logic and formal debate as disciplines in their own right, Sanskrit grammar and linguistics, medicine, and what we would now loosely call the early sciences, astronomy and mathematics, alongside a range of broader philosophical traditions circulating across India at the time, not all of them exclusively Buddhist. The point of this breadth wasn't simply to accumulate memorized material. It was to be able to reason with it, to hold a position under hostile questioning, to identify the weak point in someone else's argument, to understand an opposing philosophical school well enough to argue against it convincingly rather than dismiss it. A student who could only recite was considered far less accomplished than one who could think on their feet. That distinction shaped almost everything about how the institution actually functioned day to day. Nalanda's reputation, more than anything else, rested on its scholars, teachers whose authority came not from title or appointment, but from demonstrated mastery that had been tested, debated, and recognized over years. A student's relationship with a teacher would have been close and distinctly hierarchical, built around direct instruction, recitation, correction, and eventually, as the student progressed, genuine intellectual exchange. Studying under a scholar with a strong reputation carried real prestige of its own, and a student's later standing, wherever they ended up, could be shaped in part by whose teaching lineage they had come from. This was never a lecture hall filled with anonymous faces taking notes at a distance. It was a far more personal, almost apprenticeship-like relationship, repeated across dozens of subjects, and by some accounts, thousands of students spread throughout the complex, each one attached, in some fashion, to teachers who had earned their place at the front of the room. If there is one thing that defined the Nalanda classroom above everything else, it was argument. Teaching relied heavily on oral instruction, recitation, memorization, and repeated, deliberate questioning, drilled until a text lived in the student's memory rather than on a page. But debate was where the real intellectual work happened. A student didn't simply absorb a teacher's position and repeat it back. They were expected to test it, question it aloud in front of others, and, eventually, be able to construct and defend their own conclusions against direct, sometimes fierce, challenge from peers and instructors alike. Picture it, a courtyard full of voices, one student posing a question, another responding, a third stepping in to attack the logic of the response, a teacher listening and occasionally interjecting to sharpen the exchange further. This was not a quiet, orderly room. It was closer to a constant, structured intellectual sparring match, and being good at it was, in a very real sense, the measure of whether you belong there at all. This stands in real contrast to how we tend to picture education today. Rows of students quietly taking notes from a single authority at the front of a room. At Nalanda, being correct wasn't enough on its own. You had to be able to prove it out loud, under pressure, in front of people specifically trained to find the weakest point in your reasoning and push on it until it broke or held. As a Buddhist monastic institution, Nalanda's daily rhythm around food and communal living would have followed patterns broadly consistent with Buddhist monastic practice of the period, including vegetarian dietary customs common across many Buddhist communities of the time, and a heavy reliance on donations, land grants, and royal patronage to sustain what was, by any measure, a very large resident population. We don't have a preserved menu, exact meal schedule, or detailed record of specific dishes from Nalanda itself, so it would be inaccurate and frankly misleading to describe precise food or timing as documented fact. What we can say with confidence is that meals were communal, modest by design in keeping with monastic discipline, and woven directly into the daily religious rhythm of the institution rather than existing as a separate, purely social occasion the way we might think of a modern dining hall. So what did an actual day look like? Piecing together what we know from monastic practice, Xuanzang's descriptions, and the physical layout of the site, and being clear that this is a historical reconstruction, not a documented hour-by-hour timetable. A student's day may have followed something like this: early morning, religious observance, and personal ritual, likely before the heat of the day set in. Then study, reading, reciting, and reviewing texts often aloud, often in small groups working through the same passage together until it was fixed in memory. Formal instruction with a teacher at some point in the morning or midday, followed by discussion or debate among fellow students, actively testing what had just been taught rather than simply absorbing it passively. A communal meal, taken alongside dozens of others in the same courtyard or hall. More study in the afternoon, quite possibly focused on the more technical disciplines like grammar or logic that demanded slow, repeated, careful practice rather than quick memorization. And in the evening, further recitation, quiet individual study, or continued discussion with fellow students before the day finally closed and rest began. It was a life built almost entirely around two forces working together: discipline and constant dialogue. Very little of it would have happened in true silence. Life at Nalanda operated under monastic rules governing conduct, communal living, and religious observance. The same broad framework of discipline expected of Buddhist monks generally, extended outward to cover the intense educational life built on top of it. This wasn't a rigid, punishing existence defined by fear, and it wasn't a loose, casual campus atmosphere either. Both extremes tend to flatten what was likely a much more balanced daily reality. It was structured because structure was what allowed many thousands of people to live, study, worship, and debate together in close quarters, year after year, without the whole system collapsing into chaos. Discipline wasn't positioned as the opposite of intellectual freedom here. It was the framework that made serious, sustained intellectual work possible at this scale in the first place. Walk through Nalanda's courtyard in this period, and you would not have heard only one language or met only one kind of person. Historical accounts describe students and scholars arriving from across the Indian subcontinent and from far beyond it. China, Tibet, Korea, and Southeast Asia are all mentioned in surviving records as regions Nalanda drew scholars from. Xuanzang himself was one of these travelers, journeying thousands of miles overland from China specifically to study and eventually teach at Nalanda, before returning home with manuscripts that would go on to shape Buddhist scholarship across East Asia for centuries afterward. For an ordinary student, this meant something significant and probably a little disorienting at first. You weren't simply absorbing one fixed, local body of knowledge from people who thought exactly like you. You were living and studying alongside people who had arrived from entirely different intellectual and cultural worlds, different assumptions, different starting points, sometimes different languages entirely, all drawn to the exact same place for roughly the same reason. Nalanda's manuscript collections, often referred to collectively by the name Dharmaganja, were central to its identity as a center of learning, not a peripheral feature of it. Copying, studying, and carefully preserving texts by hand was not a side activity fitted in around lessons. It was one of the core functions of the institution, and one of the main reasons knowledge from this period survived at all in a world without printing. The libraries are also the subject of one of Nalanda's most widely repeated claims, that after the site was attacked and destroyed, sometime around the late 12th century, the manuscript collections burned for months on end. This detail appears constantly in popular retellings, but it rests on limited and considerably later secondary sources rather than a clearly documented contemporary account. So it deserves to be held loosely rather than repeated as settled historical fact. What is far better supported is the underlying loss itself. A library built up and maintained over many centuries, along with a substantial portion of the specific texts it held, was largely destroyed in this period, and that loss is considered one of the great tragedies of pre-modern intellectual history. For a student walking these same halls centuries earlier, though none of that had happened yet, the library wasn't a symbol of loss. It was simply the beating heart of the whole place, the reason more than any other single thing that people had walked for weeks to be here at all. There is no strong evidence that Nalanda relied on anything resembling a modern written examination, with fixed questions answered in silence on paper. Instead, a student's progress was measured through live performance, how accurately and fluently they could recite a text from memory, how effectively they could construct and hold a position in open debate, and ultimately, how their teachers and peers regarded their command of a subject over time. Success at Nalanda, in other words, wasn't a grade written down somewhere. It was reputation, built publicly, tested repeatedly, and earned through argument, in front of an audience specifically qualified to judge whether you actually understood what you claimed to. For a student who completed years of study at Nalanda, several paths lay open ahead of them. Some stayed on at the institution to teach the next generation of arrivals, continuing the same tradition they had just come through. Some returned to their home regions as respected scholars, monks, or advisors, carrying Nalanda's reputation with them into new communities. Others, like Xuanzang, carried physical manuscripts and memorized teachings back across enormous distances, translating and transmitting what they had learned into entirely new cultural and linguistic contexts far from where they had originally studied it. In this way, a single student's education never really ended at Nalanda's gates. It kept traveling through the texts they carried home, the students they went on to teach themselves, and the ideas they continued to pass on for the rest of their working lives, often decades after they had left. Step back far enough, and Nalanda becomes something larger than an impressive ruin in modern Bihar. It stands as one of history's clearest early examples of organized, residential, cross-cultural higher learning, operating centuries before anything resembling a university, in the European sense, existed on the other side of the world. It tells us something worth sitting with about how societies choose to build institutions around the pursuit of knowledge. That education, even in the ancient world, could be rigorous, argumentative, deeply communal, and genuinely international, all at the same time. Not a single teacher quietly passing down fixed answers to be memorized and repeated, but an entire community organized around constantly testing those answers out loud against each other day after day for hundreds of years. Picture that same student again, years later now, standing at Nalanda's gates, but facing the other direction this time. Behind them, years of recitation, debate, discipline, and long nights spent working through difficult texts by lamplight, surrounded by people from places they'd never even heard of before arriving. Ahead, a long road home, carrying manuscripts, memories, and ideas that will outlive the walls they first learned them behind. Nalanda was never just a collection of buildings, however impressive those buildings were. It was a network of people, students, teachers, travelers, scribes, passing knowledge from one mind to the next, across generations and across an entire continent. And in some form, scattered across the texts and traditions it helped shape, that transmission never really stopped. If you enjoyed this journey into the past, subscribe. There are plenty more forgotten worlds to uncover.